I wake before the shift klaxon, not because of discipline, but because the recycler coughs on the same beat every morning, and my lungs learn it like a hymn. The room is 8 by 6 if you trust the stencil on the bulkhead, but numbers lie when the air is heavy and the walls sweat condensation. My cot creaks when I sit up, springs complaining in a dialect of pain I understand better than most prayers. The blanket is grey and thin and honest, a relic of 1,000 laundries that never quite bleached out the factory smell. I swing my feet to the floor and kiss the cold spot in the metal where the paint wore through months ago. It is a small ritual, and the Emperor loves small rituals almost as much as he loves obedience. The lumen globe over the door flickers the way it always does. 3 short, 1 long, like it is practicing to be a signal light on a dying ship. I tap the casing twice with my knuckle to soothe the spirit, and whisper the maintenance catechism through cracked lips. The glow steadies to a tired hum that promises nothing and keeps that promise with perfect fidelity. Across from the cot is the fold-down desk, varnish bubbled by steam from the lav alcove and scored with lines I carved during the last ration shortfall when counting was easier than thinking. The desk rattles when I open it, because 1 hinge pin is a nail I begged from a pipe fitter, and bribes do not make good engineering. The picked slate bolted above the desk loops the same 3 reels every morning, work notices, devotionals, and the overseer's smile stretched into a threat. I keep the audio low so I can hear the corridor, and the corridor can't hear me breathing. The lav curtain is stiff with old detergent and fear, and when I pull it aside, the recyc spout coughs up water that tastes like coins and birthdays I do not remember. I scrub fast to conserve the heat, tracing a tiny aquila in the fog on the mirror shard I salvaged from a bin behind the Hab Warden's office. The mirror returns a face that looks like a schematic for fatigue, all lines and smudges, eyes rimmed in red like warning lights in an engine room. I straighten my shoulders to see if the reflection will follow orders, and it does, but only because it is as tired of me as I am of it. I dry with the 1 towel I own, a piece of old banner with the edge of a saint's halo stitched in thread that insists on catching against the scabs on my knuckles. By the door is my shrine, not large, but nothing holy is large in places like this. A scorched aquila sits on a shelf of scrap steel, wings warped from a heat surge last winter when the boilers decided suffering was a sacrament. Beside it rests a stub of candle that has learned patience, and a strip of purity parchment with a catechism stamp so faint I recite it from memory to save the ink the insult of being seen. I light the candle, and its smoke tastes like old incense and new dust, and the gap between them is where faith lives. I press my thumb to the parchment until the oil prints a shine that looks almost like approval. From the corridor comes the sound of boots and a child coughing in triplets, and somewhere above a valve screams and then remembers it is supposed to be strong. I open the ration slot, and the box offers today's mercy, a brick of corpse starch, square as a verdict, wrapped in film that pretends to keep flavor in and reality out. I cut the brick into even pieces because symmetry is the cheapest form of luxury available to me. The heating plate ticks as it wakes, and I murmur a promise of fresh oil if it behaves, which is the same promise I give my hands. When the starch sizzles, it smells almost like bread, but not like hope. I sprinkle spice powder from a contraband twist that tastes of peppers in the memory of someone wealthier, and the room pretends to become a kitchen for as long as the steam lasts. I eat standing, because chairs invite lingering, and lingering is where thoughts find you. On the bulkhead by the door, a tally of dents climbs in chalk like a pilgrim's ladder, each mark a time the neighbor banged into the wall, hauling a toolbox or a grudge. I listen for the lift's chain rattle 2 floors down, a sound that tells me the hive is awake, and I should be too. My boots sit under the cot like obedient animals, laces coiled and tongues out, and when I slide them on, they remember my feet better than I do. I pull on my work jacket and feel the weight of the patch that says I belong to something, which is comforting until you remember what that something is. The Auspex lock beside the door reads my palm, hesitates as if considering a better life, then clicks because better lives are for other doors. Before I leave, I do the room's rounds, which is what I call the tour of everything that can fail. I tap the lumen again and count to 5 to make sure it fears me. I open the desk, check the drawer where I keep the string, the needle, the paperclip, the treasures that make me powerful in a way the overseer does not understand. I kneel and clear hair and grit from the floor drain with a bent spoon. I refuse to throw away because one day I will need a bent spoon more than a straight one. I tighten the shrine shelf screw a quarter turn and step back to see if the Aquila approves, and the candle flame nods like a priest weary of weddings. At the lav, I whisper to the valve with a voice I use on frightened animals and low machinery, and sometimes myself. It does not answer, but it does not scream, and that is answer enough. On the picked slate, the devotion reel cuts to a saint marching past fields that look like paintings and a sun that looks like mercy, and the caption says, "Obedience makes the air sweeter." I mute the reel because I prefer my lies plain. The wall to the left of the cot bears a stain like a continent I will never visit, a blot of rust and damp that shifts shape with the seasons and tells more weather than any sanctioned forecast. I press my palm to it for luck, leaving a print that dries to nothing, like every mark we make that isn't etched in metal or bone. From somewhere far in the block comes the echo of a hymn, thin voices threading through vents that were designed to carry air and ended up carrying everything else too. I hum along because harmony is a kind of armor. My neighbor knocks the patterned knock that means no Arbites in the stairwell, and I answer with the patterned knock that means my door is a door and not a trap. We do not speak, because words are rationed more carefully than water, and trust is something you spend by accident. When the lift klaxon finally blares, it shakes dust from the ceiling, and a flake lands on the candle and burns like a tiny comet. I let it burn and call it a good omen, because I need one, and because omens do not file complaints. On the desk is a scrap of paper where I keep a list of things that need doing and things that need forgiving, and I pretend the columns are equal. I write oil hinges next to scrub filter and move pray for mother to the top, because memory is a machine that will seize without attention. In the corner, a small crate holds everything I would take if the Hab Warden declared a purge, which is to say, almost nothing, and the shrine, because I will not leave the spirit to strangers. There is a hole behind the crate where once a rat tried to make a home, and sometimes I think about how brave it was to choose this place and call it enough. The candle gutters and writes itself, and I take the match stub and tape it to the shelf, because spare is a word that keeps you alive. I check the curtain cord twice, because knots now save minutes later, and minutes are what separate explanations from apologies. The corridor outside breathes in drafts that smell of oil and unwashed fear, and I breathe with it the way a diver breathes with the sea. Overhead, the ducting pops as if something large just remembered it has bones, and the lumen hum threads through the sound like a thin wire holding up a heavy world. I touch the Aquila again, press my forehead to the cold metal edge until it kisses me back with a headache. And I call that blessing. My hands hover over the Auspex for a heartbeat longer than necessary, because once I open the door, the day begins. And once the day begins, it will not stop until it has taken what it came for. I look around the room like a thief memorizing exits, noting the way the cot sags to the left, and the desk leans to the right, and the shrine sits straight in the middle like a spine. There is a crack in the floor plate shaped like a lightning bolt, where an apprentice dropped a tool last month, and I have not reported it, because I like the way the light catches in its jagged mouth. I breathe in metal and candle and starch, the holy trinity of my mornings, and let it sit heavy in my chest until it becomes part of me again. In the distance, deep in the hive's throat, the generators change key the way a tired choir changes song, and I answer with a whisper that is half prayer and half threat. I smooth the blanket with the back of my hand, pulling the corners sharp until they could cut, because precision is a language even the dark respects. I press the auspex, hear the door seals unlatch like teeth unclenching, and feel the room exhale around me, as if relieved to be briefly rid of its burden. I take one last step to the shrine, pinch the candle out with spit on my fingers to spare the wick, and leave the smoke to write my name on the air where only the machine god can read it. Then I square my shoulders under the jacket's weight and place my palm flat on the plate, because this is my home, and I will lock it behind me so it stays mine for one more rotation. The door has an ear, and I treat it like a priest with a temper. I lay my palm to the auspex plate and let it taste the sweat and oil I have earned. The screen flares with a sickly green and crawls a rune across the glass that means permission withheld. I whisper the opening canticle because locks in the hive prefer to be flattered before they are obeyed. The rune turns to grudging compliance, and the seal withdraws with the slow breath of a tired animal. I never step across the threshold until I have counted to 5 and listened for the sound of boots. There is a hush in the corridor that sits between useful and dangerous, and I have learned to call it caution. The lumen strip overhead buzzes in a frequency that makes my molars itch. A camera blister stares from the corner with a cracked lens like a blind eye that still remembers how to judge. Someone glued a sliver of Saint-Carte to the blister last week, and the glue dried in dribbles that look like tears. I nod to the blister because submission is a lubricant in this place. The auspex logs a faint click as it writes down my leaving like a petty scribe with endless parchment. I know the cogitator in the warden booth is compiling my crossings into patterns it will never share. Patterns mean audits, and audits mean doors that no longer open when you ask nicely. I lock the door again and press my brow to the cold metal to leave a little of my heat in the shape of a promise. The corridor sighs as another hab opens 3 doors down, and a wash of boiled cabbage and stale incense rolls past. A servo skull glides by, dragging a tail of incense smoke that pretends to sanctify the stale air. Its vox grill ticks like a cricket as it pings the auspex plates for delinquent spirits. I keep my hands visible because skulls enjoy problems they can record. The skull lingers just long enough to let me imagine it marking my name. Then it hums away, muttering Bin-Hurric syllables like curses shaped for machines. On the wall, a devotional pict has been scrubbed so often the saint's face is more suggestion than memory. Someone has written a prayer in charcoal under it, and someone else has crossed it out and written a different prayer. The wardens once tried to ban charcoal because words written by the poor are always dangerous. Now they simply fine us for carrying it. I carry it anyway, because a line on a wall can be a map when you need one. I pass the meter niche, where the block's auspex veins tangle into a nest of copper and resentment. The panel is sealed with a purity ribbon stamped in red wax so soft that even the air has smudged it. When the ribbon droops too low, the wardens come with incense and threats and a hammer for the first door that looks guilty. No one admits to watching the ribbon sag on purpose. Everyone admits to feeling lighter after the hammer leaves. The vox grill above the stairwell coughs and births the overseer's voice in tones flavored like metal filings. Curfew adjustment for level 9, it says, then says it again, slower, as if obedience has bad ears. I mark the new numbers in my head and slot them beside the old numbers, because forgetting a curfew is a luxury for the dead. A child's laugh cracks from behind a door, and someone shushes it with urgent love. The shush lasts longer than the laugh, and I respect that endurance. A plasteel notice plate lists violations and the fines are longer than the violations. One line reads unsanctioned illumination, and I touch the pocket where I keep a stolen match and feel like a heretic and a hero. The lift cage at the end of the corridor is a mouth built to swallow hope and spit out workers. Its grate bears a chain of stamped tags naming every accident it has survived, and there are more tags than teeth on the cog I wear to work. I push the call rune, and it answers with a bored chime that thinks my request is beneath it. While it climbs, I do the holy arithmetic of risk that stands between habit and caution. Arbites pass on the hour and the half when the docket is heavy. The docket is always heavy. If they come while I am inside the cage, they will see me as a silhouette with a number, and men like that enjoy silhouettes because they cannot weep. The cage arrives coughing rust, and the gate jerks like a drunk learning manners. I step inside and place my palm on the inner plate to reassure the machine it is not being stolen. The inner lumen flickers and stabilizes, and I whisper, "Thanks, because please and thank you are the cheapest parts." The cage shudders downward through a throat of pipes that sweat like honest workers. Graffiti crawls across the shaft walls in layers like sedimentary fear. Names scratched with nail heads, prayers etched with wire. A map to a market that was raided 2 years ago and still draws the desperate like a broken magnet. "Trust the cog," someone wrote, and someone else beneath it carved, "Trust the hand that holds it." The cage stops on 6, and a group of workers climb in with their eyes already turned down to save time. We do not speak because words in lifts echo into reports. One of them wears a rebreather that wheezes like an old dog, and I envy the honesty of the sound. The Auspex plate inside the cage ticks again, and I know it is counting breaths like coins. We descend another level, and the gate rattles open on a landing lit by a lumen that screams without stopping. We hold our breaths through the scream because it feels like the right kind of respect. On the landing, a pict capture is mounted above a donation box with a slot too thin for hope. The pict shows a man smiling with all the teeth faith can buy, and the caption reads, "The Emperor sees you even in small things." I drop a washer into the box because I like to be seen in small things. The picture blinks. I tell myself it is a power fluctuation. The lift continues and the skull returns, this one with a quill mounted to its jaw like a beak designed for paperwork. It jots notes on parchment that unfurls from its spine in a scroll of sins. The parchment smells like damp, and I do not ask what it is made of. The skull peers through the grate and lingers on the rebreather. The worker keeps his gaze down and his hands folded, and I learn from his discipline. The skull clicks again and writes something, and I pretend it wrote mercy. The cage stops at 5, and the workers spill out like bolts from a box. I remain to ride to 4 because the meter for my block sits there like a heart that only knows how to race. On 4, the corridor widens enough to encourage mistakes. A warden kiosk bulges from the wall like a tumor with glass. Inside, a clerk sits with a data slate and a jaw so tired it looks detachable. He does not look up as I pass, because looking up is over time. A motion detector above the kiosk blinks at the rate of a nervous pulse. I match my pace to the blink because moving on someone else's rhythm is a habit that reduces friction. The water main runs behind a mesh grill that whines when the pressure shifts. Someone hung purity seals from the mesh, so the wind from the pipes makes the parchment flutter like a shy saint's hands. I stop and press my fingers to the mesh and beg the spirit for a day of clear water. The mesh vibrates and I take that as assent. Across the corridor a door sits with 3 locks and 4 prayers, and still looks afraid. The family inside has a new baby, and fear leaks through gaps like heat. They have hung chimes of scrap and teeth over the lintel to confuse evil with noise. The chimes tinkle when the ducting exhales, and I choose to enjoy the music. An Arbitit's patrol rounds the far corner with boots that teach the floor obedience. Their visors reflect the lumen so that they wear a strip of false daylight across their faces. I flatten my hands to the wall and show them the emptiness of my palms like I am offering a gift. The patrol does not slow because slowing suggests curiosity. And curiosity is a resource reserved for other districts. They leave behind a smell like oiled leather and procedure. I breathe again and hear the tiny crackle of the corridor vox opening to birth a list of names that will not answer. The names float like dust until the grill clicks shut. From a vent above my head, a whisper runs like a mouse with secrets. Some say there are maintenance spirits in the vents that trade favors for oil. Some say there are only people in the vents who forgot how to come out. I slide a tiny tin of machine oil onto the rear lip of the grill and do not watch it vanish. The lumen strip stutters, and the dark breathes in, then out, then in again with the steady rhythm of a large animal that has found sleep. In that 3-count shallow dusk, I feel the corridor looking back at me. The cameras stare, and the Auspex listens, and the Vox dreams, and together they make a kind of household where affection is measured in tolerances. A door opens behind me, and a smell of hot metal and soap rolls over my shoulders like a heavy blanket. "Filter day," a voice says, and I nod without turning because names are expensive. We do not share filters, but we share the knowledge that a clean one means fewer funerals. At the bend where 4 meets the stairwell to the service chase, a little chapel squats with a door too short for pride. Inside the lumen is soft, and the incense is sharp, and the icon stands behind glass with 3 scratches I count every time. I step in, dip 2 fingers in a bowl that claims to contain water from Terra and actually contains water from the same pipe as my hab. I trace the aquila on my brow and ask that the door remember me tonight. I ask that the Auspex not learn my bad habits. I ask that the camera blink at the right moment, if it must blink at all. I leave 2 thrones in the box for candles I will never see. Outside the chapel, a maintenance panel sits slightly ajar as if it wants to confess. I push it closed and latch it with the clip I keep for such moments, and whisper to it that we keep each other safe by pretending to be whole. Down the hall, a pair of habwardens argue in hushed tones that still manage to bruise the air. Their batons hang on lanyards like restrained dogs. One taps a slate, frowns, taps again, frowns again, and the other glances at the camera blister as if to borrow authority. I keep my eyes on the floor until the floor shifts into stairs. The stairwell is bolted cage and stone, slick with the grease of 1,000,000 hands that prayed for balance and received it often enough to continue praying. On the landing, a sign reads, "Report suspicious behavior," and someone has scratched below it. "Define suspicious." Another hand has scratched below that. "Anything with a face." I wonder which of us wrote that, and whether they slept well afterward. A service servitor lumbers past, dragging a cable that hums in a minor key. Its face is a forgetful mask, and its chest bears a plate that says, "Property of Department 7, and the word property is cut deeper than the rest. I step aside and let it pass, because to block it is to invite repetition of instructions in a tone that makes your spine feel numeric. The cable leaves a smear, and I wipe the smear with my sleeve because the warden will find the nearest sleeve if it remains. A little farther on, the corridor narrows in a way that suggests the walls are tired of being walls and are considering becoming teeth. I hold myself thin and glide through and count my ribs by feel, because counting is a way to keep from speaking. At the corner there is a dead lumen that no petition has revived. We call the black triangle it casts the blind spot, and we pass through it with our chins down as if the dark were a superior officer. I never linger there because lingering tempts the sort of attention that makes doors curious about new owners. A poster on the far wall peels in the shape of a city I have never seen. The city has spires like needles and bridges like scars and windows that look like eyes that enjoy blinking. Below the poster, a small box is bolted to the wall with a slit for complaints. The slit is jammed with folded paper flecked by mildew and resignation. Sometimes at night, the slit exhales one of those papers, and it lies in the dust like a white fish. I pick them up when I find them and fold them smaller, and push them back in because I believe in containment. The corridor bends again, and the ambient hum changes from the timbre of water to the timbre of current. That means I am near the power trunk, and near the power trunk the cameras are more awake than usual. I lower my head further and slow my breath until it is a number the Auspex already knows. A thin wire of music drifts from someone's door and wavers as if trying to remember the next note. Music is forbidden unless sanctioned, and everything sanctioned sounds like marching. This does not sound like marching. It sounds like a person choosing a note because it hurts less than silence. I keep walking and pretend I do not hear it, because mercy is a practice that improves with disuse in places like this. The floor under my boots changes pitch as bolts give way to welds. The welds vibrate in the bones of my feet like a warning that wants to be personal. I flatten my hand against the wall and feel the throb of the hive like a pulse under skin. The wall thumps back once, and I answer with my fingers the way one machine greets another. Somewhere behind me, the camera blister clicks as it shifts its gaze from the corner to the stair, and I do not turn because turning suggests I believe I am interesting. I walk as if escorted by a friend I trust. The Auspex plates blink their little lights in a sequence that becomes a lullaby if you are tired enough. I let the lullaby carry the seconds while the corridor does its work of watching, and I do my work of being seen correctly. When a door opens ahead of me, I step sideways on instinct and align myself with the shadow that lives beneath the conduit. The person who emerges carries a bundle of filters bound in twine that used to be a prayer ribbon. Our eyes meet for the duration of a heartbeat, and we both nod. The nod that says we agree to know nothing. They pass, and the scent of industrial soap and borrowed resolve follows after. The Vox coughs again and spills a new decree about visitors to the block, and the words sound as if they have been chewed and swallowed and chewed again. I picture the decree as a small grey animal trying to cross a busy road, and I step over it without touching it. Above my head, a maintenance drone scuttles along its rail, pausing to sniff with a sensor wand at a seam that leaks a sigh. It chirps, and a panel irises open, and a nozzle spits a line of cork that smells like almonds and mortal sin. The drone hums away, and the seam is quiet, and I admire the competence of small machines, while distrusting the intentions of large ones. A bell rings from the far end of the passage where the warden's office keeps time. It is not the hour bell, and not the alarm bell, and not the audit bell, and that uncertainty is a taste like tin that sits under my tongue. I reach the bend that leads back toward my block, and lay my palm on the wall where the paint is rubbed smooth by thousands of unremarkable hands. The wall is cool and steady and entirely indifferent, and I draw a little of its indifference into my bones because it helps with the watching and the being watched. I adjust the strap on my jacket so the buckle does not flash in the lumen, because flashes make cameras hungry. I swallow the dryness in my throat that sometimes sounds to me like paper turning in a file. I count the steps to my landing and find a new chip in the stair edge where someone stumbled and almost left a story. I toe the chip's crumb into the crack and press it with my heel until it fits, because mending what can be mended is a rebellion the hive allows. A draft slips under the corridor like a low voice and brings with it the distant taste of burned promethium and bakery yeast and machine incense, and I catalogue the mixture as a weather report. I pass the blind spot again and do not look into it because I know the blind spot looks back. I reach my door, and the Auspex plate glows with a memory that is either mine or the lock's. I rest my fingers on the metal just long enough to share a little heat and a little sweat and a little apology. The corridor behind me keeps breathing the way the hive breathes when it thinks no one is listening. I listen anyway because I have learned that the things which watch are comforted when you prove you are paying attention. I lean closer to the plate and whisper the sequence the machine likes to hear in the order the machine likes to hear it. I do not hurry the last syllable because locks reward patience and punish enthusiasm. The seal shivers like a creature deciding whether to be kind. I keep my eyes on the aquila stamped above the frame until the light rinses green across my knuckles and the bolt withdraws one careful tooth at a time. I let the corridor look at my back for a few more breaths while the cameras finish their counting, and the vox rests its throat, and the skulls circle whatever they are circling. Then I lower my hand and hold still long enough for the Auspex to believe in me again. Breakfast is a series of negotiations with matter and memory. I start by laying the ration brick on the plate and tapping its corners with the dull side of my knife like I am waking a small, reluctant beast. The brick is beige, the way bureaucracy is beige. I cut it into squares with such care that I almost forgive it for being food by decree. Each square is a little promise that tastes like cardboard and obedience. I heat the plate and watch the surface shimmer until it looks like a mirage laid flat. Steam rises in a tired ribbon and brushes my face with the warmth of a handshake I wish were friendlier. I dust the squares with contraband spice that pretends to be pepper and dreams about fields I have never seen. The scent is thin, but it manages to climb into the air and sit on the ceiling like a prayer too shy to descend. I crack the top of the algae tin and spread the paste with the edge of a spoon I bent into the shape of a trowel. The paste is green that forgot how to be green. It glistens like pond water that learned manners. I fold 2 squares together and chew with the courtesy I reserve for superiors and dentists. Texture does most of the work while taste rests. My tongue remembers better meals the way scars remember better skin. I drink from the canteen and let the metallic tang take the edges off my hunger like a file. The water is never cold, but it is more honest than the broth. I sit on the fold-down stool because chairs with backs are for people who can afford to lean. The picked slate shows a smiling family at a table long enough to seat regret. They pass a bowl of something that casts a shadow like real meat, and the caption says, "Gratitude makes flavor stronger." I turn the picked slate toward the wall and tell gratitude it can wait its turn. On the desk, I keep a tin of salt I bought from a woman who never smiles and always counts twice. I use 3 grains because 3 grains mark a feast, and because the tin must last longer than I will. I save the last corner of starch for after the prayer, because dessert is a habit that keeps me from becoming a machine with hands. I wipe the plate with a scrap of stale loaf the size of a saint's thumbnail and think of crumbs as currency. The fork tines are misaligned and sing against a metal when I set them down, and I let the note fade like a secret. I stack the plate on the heating coil so the residual warmth can dry everything without wasting fuel. I sweep stray spice with the side of my palm and press it into a line I can lift with a fingertip. I do not waste spice, because I do not waste stories about better days. I fold the ration wrapper 3 times and tuck it behind the pipe because wrappers make fine tinder and better excuses. The candle on the shrine is thick with old drips that look like a frozen argument. I light it with an ember pinched from the coil and inhale the first breath of smoke like a borrowed memory. The flame hesitates, then remembers it is a flame, and the room acknowledges the decision by softening. I hold the strip of purity parchment close enough to warm it, but not scorch it. Heat loosens the ink's smell, and the smell loosens my jaw. I speak the catechism slowly, so the words fit into the cracks the night left in me. Each line is a step. Each step is a hinge. Each hinge opens just enough. I touch my forehead, my breast, each shoulder, then tap the aquila twice the way my father taught me, when prayer was still a story and not a tool. I add a name to the list of the remembered, and today the name is a worker who died 2 bays over beneath a crate that wanted attention. I share half of my last square with the memory and set it on the shelf until the candle smokes it into something that smells like offerings used to smell. I eat my half and try not to imagine the equality of the division. Sleep lingers at the edges of morning like a debtor. I do not invite it because work would take that as an insult. Still, I treat rest as a craft that must be kept sharp. On the cot, I keep a cloth bag filled with machine fluff, clean and dry, stitched into a pillow by hands that owed me kindness. I punch the bag twice and it sighs with the resignation of a practiced servant. The blanket is thin, but I fold it double at the feet because warmth gathers where you plan for it. I lay down and let my bones adjust to the math of the springs. The cot speaks in small chirps, and I answer with a stillness I learned from hiding. On the ceiling, the dents arrange themselves into constellations I rename every week to trick my mind into novelty. There is the saint of narrow escapes. There is the cog that never slips. There is the little bird that lives inside the generator and eats screams. I breathe in for 4 and out for 7 because numbers tidy the room between my ears. The recycler coughs in the next chamber, and I place the sound on a shelf labeled "Not My Emergency." A footstep passes in the corridor, and I name it neighbor, not warden. Another breath, and I let my jaw loosen enough to prove I am not biting the day already. I think about the stove ember cooling, and decide to enjoy the brief window when the room smells like not quite smoke. I let my tongue find a grain of salt against a molar, and I count it as a blessing. I consider sleep again, and this time I let it step inside without removing its boots. I set the timer cog by feel and promise myself 10 minutes, which in the hive is a king's ransom of softness. In those 10 minutes, I drift into the place where the lumen hum blends with the blood hum and the border patrols grow lazy. I do not dream in pictures much. I dream in textures and temperatures and the pressure of a hand on a shoulder that might be mine. The candle ticks when it remembers to, and I float on the ticks like a pilgrim on stepping stones. The timer cog clicks, and my eyes open to the room returning itself to me. Getting up is a ritual, too. I roll to my side and sit without using my hands, so the springs keep their opinions. I fold the blanket edge to edge, with the precision of someone who has been inspected more times than spoken to kindly. I smooth the pillow bag and press it flat, and feel the breath push out of it like a tiny weather change. I tuck the corners under the mattress so the cot wears its outfit properly. I tuck the parchment strip's frayed edge back under the nail so it will not droop when I need it to stand. I tip the candle to pour old wax from the rim into a pool I can re-melt later, and I catch the spill with the back of a spoon worn bright by such catches. I scrape the plate and collect the crisp crumbs in a twist of paper I keep for moments, when a crumb is the difference between patience and anger. I wash the spoon with 3 drops from the canteen and a whisper to the valve that I am not being greedy. I dry the spoon with the corner of my sleeve because sleeves were invented as towels for those who must not look poor. I put the spoon back in its place with the knife laid parallel so that order can climb from one thing to the next like a ladder. I run a cloth over the desk surface in straight lines so the grain of the varnish is encouraged to remember duty. I shake the cloth out the window slot and watch dust leap like sparrows forbidden by law. The slot admits a breeze thin as a blade, and I cut my thoughts with it into manageable slices. I open the locker and check the hooks where my habits hang. Apron, goggles, mask. A length of cord braided from unraveled cuffs, for when something needs to be convinced to stay. I turn the mask over and listen to the whisper of the filter and praise it for its stubbornness. The goggles are scratched in arcs that recall shrapnel and hail and cheap soap. I spit on the lenses and polish them with the hem of a shirt that has learned to be humble. I tie the cord into a loop knot I can open with one finger because one finger is sometimes all that remains free. I inventory the pocket box where the little tools live. 1 hex key worn to a prayer, 2 paper clips bent into alphabets for locks, a shard of mirror that does more work than most men, a stub of chalk that writes like a captive and erases like a ghost. I place the box back exactly where the shadow says it belongs. I check the edges of the room again to confirm no new darkness has collected there during breakfast. The corners pass the inspection with the weary competence of veterans. On the wall, a list of names waits for my thumbprints. I press each name with a clean pad of skin and say the syllables aloud in the order that suits them best. Saying names is a way to pay a tax to the past. I move my thumb down to the bottom where the new line is blank, and I do not write another name there today. I put the tin of salt away behind the valve pipe because no one looks for treasure in the throat of a machine. I blow gently on the candle to make it lean, and I catch the lean with a match I saved from last feast day. The match wants to flare and die, and I ask it to flare and live, and it compromises. I set it beside the wick, so tomorrow will arrive a heartbeat faster. I palm the canteen again and weigh it, and decide I can risk 3 more swallows if I sip like a saint pretending to be mortal. The water moves grudgingly, and I accept the lesson. I check the time by the way the lumen's buzz lines up with the recycler's cough. The alignment says I am early by 2 coughs and 1 buzz. Being early is a luxury disguised as anxiety. I use the extra moments to practice the quiet arts. I sit and rest my hands on my knees and feel the room lean around me like a tent in a careful wind. I close my eyes and picture each tool where it belongs, each hinge at ease, each screw with the right attention. I picture the door, and I decide that today it will open like a friend who owes me a favor. I picture the lift, and I decide that today it will hold me like a bucket holds water and not like a mouth holds prey. I picture the overseer, and I decide that today he will see through me to the work and miss the parts of me that crackle like a short circuit. I open my eyes, and the room is exactly as I left it, which is the victory I require from most things. I place the ration tin on the desk's left corner because left corners are where hunger becomes strategy. I place the spice twist under the tin because hiding it in plain sight is a joy I can afford. I push the stool back against the wall until it clicks into the groove its feet carved in the paint. I set my boots heel to heel under the cot so the laces kiss and promise not to knot themselves while I am gone. I smooth the parchment again because smoothing is a language I speak fluently. I pinch a fleck of candle soot and smear it across my thumb pad as if taking a fingerprint of the flame will let me borrow its resolve. I wipe the soot on my jacket where stains gather like medals. I whisper to the air that I will return, and I try to sound convincing. I step to the lav and lay another strip of cloth along the recyc spout to catch the drip that insists on measuring time with its own calendar. The cloth darkens, and the drip hushes, and I take both as compliments. I align the knife with the spoon and fork once more, because arrangement is a low, constant prayer. I crack the window slot open a finger width to let the room exhale after me. I rest my palm on the shrine shelf and feel the metal cool under the new skin my work grows every week. I bend my head and let my forehead touch the scorched aquila so the scar of heat can speak to the scar of worry. I breathe out and watch the candle stir and settle like a creature that trusts me enough to sleep nearby. I turn toward the door and feel the gravity of the cot tug at the back of my knees like a polite child. I decline the invitation, and the cot forgives me with a small sigh. I gather the crumbs and tuck them into the paper twist, and tuck the twist into the pocket that never betrays me. I thumb the list of things to forgive one more time, and add my own name for the morning I wanted too much. I blink at the lumen to make it feel reciprocated. I press my hand to the Auspex plate, and it takes my heat and asks for more, and I give it what I can. I listen to the corridor beyond, breathing like a large animal that has agreed, for now, not to bite. I roll my shoulders to settle the jacket and stir the smell of spice and soap into something that might read as human from a distance. I lick the last film of algae from my teeth because waste is a story I refuse to write. I turn the latch and the room holds still and watches me as if to learn how to be brave. I tell it in a whisper that bravery is just a set of small habits repeated until someone mistakes them for courage. I lean once more toward the candle and hold my breath until the flame leans back as if returning a nod. I open the door and let the cool corridor touch my cheeks like a stern aunt. I step through with the smooth motion of someone who has practiced being unremarkable. I pull the door after me with the care of a person closing the lid on a box of live matches. I feel the latch seat with a click that tells me the room has agreed to keep my secrets until I return. I place my palm flat to the metal and leave a print shaped like a promise I intend to keep. They sent me to the fields on a transfer chit with the ink still wet, and the promise that fresh air would mend what the hive had bent. The shuttle dropped like a dull nail into a sky that could not decide on a color, and bounced twice on a landing strip, stitched from ferrocrete and stubborn prayer. From the ramp I saw the longhouses lined along the windbreak like teeth in a jaw that had learned to bite back. The buildings were plasteel ribs over a spine of timber salvaged from shipments that never reached their original destinies. Every seam was tarred and blessed and riveted until it squeaked like a hymn. The smell of the place was wet soil, hot oil, animal breath, and the sharp clean of open distance that makes your eyes feel like small things. My hab there was a rectangle with a door that stuck in damp weather and a window that behaved like a rumor. Inside the floor was metal mesh laid over a hard-packed dirt so the mud could fall away and the vermin could be escorted to their gods without ceremony. Boots gathered in pairs by the threshold like faithful dogs, each tagged with a name scratched in wire, each cut with grooves that told the story of Rose walked and Rose survived. We slept in bunks stacked 4 high with ladders that demanded polite ankles. Blankets smelled of smoke and soap, and a sweetness that lived somewhere between hay and the memory of hay. At the longhouse center, a generator shrine hummed with a patience I envied. The casing was embossed with a cog and an aquila that argued silently about where holiness truly lived. A tech adept with iron fingers kept the shrine content with incense, oil, and litanies that had more verbs than our work orders. On the walls hung tools with their own personalities. Sickle teeth bright with jealous edges, monopliers that clicked like insects with opinions. A wrench the length of a child with a nick in the jaw that everyone called the Emperor's tolerance. At dawn, The sky came on like a door opening on a different life, and the wind arrived sideways, already angry. We ate thick stew from a pot that never cooled, and bread dense enough to stop an argument. The stew tasted of groks and roots and salt, and I loved it, not because it was good, but because it told the truth. Beyond the windbreak, the fields ran to a horizon that moved whenever you looked at it. Crops stood in ranks that would have embarrassed any parade master. Wheat bred for obedience and yield, tubers that grew like secrets, stalks of oil fern that shimmered when the sun remembered to appear. The machinery was half saint and half monster. Autoplows with bellies full of sanctified flame chewed the earth into neat promises. Cedar servitors shuffled after, their mouths full of metrics and their eyes full of weather. A reaper engine strode on 4 iron legs and wore a crown of rotating knives that sang about harvest and consequence. Everything had a name and a litany and a history of misbehavior. We spoke to the machines because they responded to attention, and out there attention was a currency that paid dividends. I learned the ways of wind in the first week. When it came hard from the east, it smelled of brine from a sea we never saw, and carried sand fine enough to polish thought. When it fell away to the south, it left a silence that even birds respected. When it circled back from the north, it brought a cough that liked to collect portfolios of lungs. The longhouse doors were built to lean into the wind, and we were built to lean with them. Rain did not fall so much as a tack. It drove in sheets that struck the plasteel with the sound of a crowd changing its mind. The gutters choked on leaves and pennants, and we cleared them with gloved hands while laughing like fools who had found fresh water in a dry faith. Lightning stitched the horizon into patterns the priest insisted were benedictions. Thunder climbed into the bunks and lay across our chests like a stubborn cat. On clear nights, the sky showed more stars than I had names for, and I tried to count them and gave up and called that surrender a kind of prayer. We kept watch for raiders because the fields fattened everyone, even the uninvited. The warning bell hung from a beam that had survived 3 relocations and 1 miracle. When it rang, we moved like a practiced hand. Shutters slammed in slots we never spoke about. Firing steps unfolded from the walls like memory returning under pressure. We shouldered battered laser guns etched with unit names that had been reassigned more times than anyone wanted to admit. I learned the taste of dust behind sandbags and the weight of a charge pack that promised both safety and regret. Sometimes the raiders were only hungry men with shabby weapons and desperate eyes. Sometimes they were worse things with laughter that sounded like gears stripping. Once they were riders from the hills wearing flak stitched with feathers and anger. They came at dusk and left at ash, and took 2 steers and a boy's thumb, and the priest's certainty. We patched the fence and the thumb, and left the certainty to fend for itself. Between alarms, life tasted of work that could be counted in rows, walked, and calluses earned. I learned the rhythm of Sour's steps, heel, then toe, then lift, so the seed falls where ground will remember it kindly. I learned to read the sky for thin bruises that said, hail would come like an audit. We dragged tarps over seedlings and prayed to saints of small things who were too busy to answer but listened anyway. At meals we sat shoulder to shoulder on benches that groaned like honest men. Stories were told in the present tense because the future was a rumor and the past was a luxury. Someone always played a mouth harp in a key that matched the generator. Someone always laughed too loudly and then apologized to the icon on the wall. We brewed a thin beer from leavings and hope and called it field courage. It made the night warmer and the morning informative. The priest came every 3rd rotation with a stack of catechisms and a sack of candles stamped with seals that flaked like old paint. He carried a shotgun and a smile he lent to funerals. He blessed the plows and the animals, and the little bag of soil each of us kept in a pocket to remind us where we belonged. He told us the Emperor watched all labor with equal love, and we nodded and pretended we did not notice who ate meat most nights. Predators stalked the edges where the hedge met the dark. Slinkhounds with too many teeth watched with patience that suggested education. Wirecats moved like cut lines come alive. We set snares approved by the warden and traps improved by the men. In the morning the traps held lessons. Sometimes the lesson was that hunger walks on 4 legs. Sometimes the lesson was that we had underestimated the creativity of teeth. We kept a small infirmary in the back of the longhouse where the air smelled of camphor and metal and arguments with infection. The medic was a woman with hands that could find a splinter and a mood with equal confidence. She kept her instruments in a box that had once held religious texts and said both were for opening stubborn things. Her sutures were neat, and her bedside manner was a prayer that assumed you would pull your weight tomorrow. On the far side of the fields rose a cluster of storage silos with domed tops like helmets watching the plain. Their elevators wheezed with pride, and their ladders asked questions of knees. We filled them with grain that would travel by rail and by river and by decree to places whose maps were drawn with brighter inks. When the quota was posted on the board, the numbers sat like boulders on our weeks. We measured ourselves against them and against each other and against weather that did not care about either. Markets sprang up when the sky behaved, and the roads did not sprout checkpoints overnight. Traders rolled in on crawlers patched with 40 colors of paint and 5 philosophies of maintenance. They sold salt that had seen oceans and cloth that had met dyes and charms carved from things that once made noises. We traded eggs and surplus and favors and gossip, with denominations clearly understood. A tinker sold me a pocket auspex that measured rain in compromises, and I carried it like a talisman that could read the mind of clouds. From time to time, the Planetary Defense Force sent a patrol that smelled like polish and detachment. They inspected the fence and the watch ledger and the souls of anyone who avoided eye contact for too long. Their sergeant had a scar that cut through his salute, and a voice that could make a recruit stand up straighter 2 counties away. He said we were doing the Emperor's work, and I thanked him because we were, and because thanks costs less than ammunition. Sometimes a pilgrim band crossed the fields on a line that pointed somewhere holy. They sang until their throats gave out, and then they hummed, and then they walked in silence that rattled. We gave them water and bread and a half-day's shade, and they left us little tin saints with uneven faces that looked far more like us than any official icon. In drought, the ground cracked into maps that led nowhere. We opened the cisterns with keys on chains that pinched pride. We rationed in ladles and in looks. We prayed over irrigation tubes as if they were sick children. We lined the longhouse with wet cloth and sat near the generator because its heartbeat at least kept time when the rest of the world decided to improvise. In flood, we built pontoons for machines and rafts for pride. We hauled sacks and swore oaths and learned which boots lie about being waterproof. We laughed when we could and when we could not. We pretended coughing was laughter to conserve the ritual. When the harvest came proper, the fields changed sound. The stalks whispered in a language that forgave many things. The reapers stalked and sang, and the granaries gulped like friendly giants. We worked under lamps that made night look like a patient problem. Hands blistered and healed and blistered again, and called it a conversation. We slept in shifts and dreamed in sheaves, and woke to the metronome of auger screws. On the frontier edge, the homes got smaller and more determined. I spent a few months posted to a mobile unit that was a room on treads with a temper. The crawler home had a bunk shelf, a fold-down bench, and a galley that could convince boiling water to be pleased with itself. We lashed our lives to hooks before moving because anything unsecured belongs to the god of bumps. The walls were lined with racks for tools and racks for prayers, and the distinction was mostly aesthetic. At night, we circled the crawlers nose to tail, so the wind had to argue with metal before it could argue with us. We hung chimes of spent casings to tattle on intrusive breezes. We set tripwires that whispered to flares and flares, that shouted at thieves and thieves that sometimes turned out to be foxes with excellent timing. The frontier had less law and more consequence. Maps were current for 3 days, and then they were art. We adjusted routes based on the mood of ravines and the recent politics of mud. Sometimes we followed a river that felt generous, and sometimes we climbed a ridge that wanted to keep our boots. We paid tithe at a way station built from 7 kinds of hope and 1 variety of heavy stubber. The way station keeper stamped our manifest and our consciences with equal indifference. He sold us lamp oil and rumour came bottled by the measure. On the 3rd week, a storm boiled up that turned the sky into a slate wiped by an angry teacher. We battened everything, and then we battened ourselves with belts across our waists so the crawler would know where to put us when it finished shaking. The rain hit like birds, and then like bullets, and then like a decision we had postponed too long. When it passed, the world smelled scrubbed and insulted. We walked out to count what had been moved and what had learned to stay. A fence section lay flat like a soldier who had finally obeyed gravity. A scarecrow had found new employment as a banner half a field away. The shrine on the crawler's dash had turned itself shy side down, and we apologized until it forgave us by not catching fire. We met settlers who had carved their homes out of kits and audacity. Their doors had names, and their windows had histories, and their porches had opinions. They kept small gardens in boxes, and larger gardens in promises. They wore knives like arguments, and smiles like currency. We traded repairs for stories, and stories for supper, and supper for directions that were half folklore and half geometry. A woman showed me a bundle of seeds wrapped in cloth stamped with a manufactorum sigil, and a saint's face added in child's ink. She said she planted them with 1 prayer for rain and 1 for restraint, and I understood why both were needed. A boy asked to see my auspex, and I let him hold it, and he held it like a bird he meant to release. He pressed his ear to the casing and said he could hear the weather making up its mind, and I believed him. At night the stars did not stop, and neither did the generator, and I found the rhythm between them. We took turns at watch and learned which noises deserve bullets and which deserve patience. I cleaned my las rifle with a care that made it purr in a language I could not speak, but could imitate. I carved a tiny aquila into the butt, and then rubbed it smooth because no symbol deserves a sharp edge against a shoulder that already carries enough. Come morning, we boiled coffee strong enough to confess, and we drank it leaning against the crawler while the sun auditioned for a place in the day. Back at the longhouse, the seasons turned like gears that sometimes slipped. We marked the turning with simple rites that could survive poor weather and poorer attendance. A ribbon hung for the first sprout, a candle for the first calf, a bell for the first frost, a shot for the first raider spotted early and ignored by luck. Between rites, we tightened bolts and rewrote ledgers and rebraided rope, and cut splints for injuries that would occur, because that is what bodies do when asked to be both tool and shield. I began to understand that out there, comfort and danger share a table, and both ask for salt. You keep both as guests because either alone will eat you. In the afternoons, when the wind allowed, we opened the longhouse windows, and the room changed personality. The incense from the shrine mixed with the smell of cut stalks, and the whole place smelled like a chapel that had remembered it was also a barn. Children ran through with chores as if speed were a virtue, and sometimes it was. An old man sharpened sickles with a whetstone that sang in 3 notes, and each note meant yes if you listened the right way. A notice board carried postings for help wanted and help offered, and a sketch of a missing dog that looked like every dog and no dog. Someone pinned a crude map of the region with a path drawn in red to a promised market, where everything cost less and nothing was stolen. We did not follow the map because we favored plausible lies over generous ones. In the evening, the wind changed and brought the noise of insects discussing theology. We sat on the steps and watched the light slide off the fields and tried to act like we were not counting the minutes until the generator took over as our second son. I mended a strap with waxed thread and a needle that had known more skins than cloth. The strap belonged to a harness that belonged to a beast that believed the world could be pulled forward if you leaned hard enough. I understood the belief and stitched as if I could strengthen it. When the moons rose, the fields silvered, and every furrow looked like a line in a book written by someone patient. We walked the perimeter with lanterns that persuaded darkness to blink. We checked the fence for new ideas and found only the old ones trying again. At the corner post, I tied a charm of twisted wire that looked vaguely like an aquila and more precisely like a knot, and I told it to listen for trouble and to tell the post first and me second. It rattled once and settled, and I counted that as professionalism. Inside the longhouse, the bunks creaked with the settling of tired people into shapes that rested. The generator kept its oath. The icon kept its stare. The doors kept their grudges. I lay on my bunk with damp sleeves rolled and a hand on my chest to remind the lungs that this air was also mine. I held in my head the map of the longhouse, the route to the cistern, the distance to the bell, the angle of the rifle on its hooks, and the smell of rain stored like a letter waiting to be read. I thought of the hive and the 8x6 and the whispering corridor, and I felt the longhouse breathe around me like a sleeping friend who kicks sometimes but never on purpose. The wind nudged the shutters, and the shutters answered like old married people who know each other's jokes. Somewhere a calf bawled, a hinge sighed, a man laughed in his sleep, a woman muttered the end of a prayer she had begun last week, and the generator turned all of it into a humming that kept the predators undecided. I pressed my thumb to the small tin saint pinned above my bunk and felt the dented metal warm against my skin like a coin that believed in me. I closed my eyes and let the world remain large and unforgiving and completely specific, and I shaped my breathing around it until it agreed to share the night. I first saw the mid-spire from a lift with windows that pretended not to be proud. The city fell away in layers until roofs became a texture and people became a rumor. The air thinned into perfume and policy. A porter with hands like folded paper met me at a vestibule that smelled of wax and yes. He wore a collar that clicked when he turned his head, as if attention were a mechanism. He asked my name in a voice trained to make names behave. I told him, and it slid off his coat like rain. The floor under my boots changed from metal to marble to something that remembered trees. Servitors polished already polished balustrades with gestures so gentle they felt like apologies. A picked tapestry on the wall showed a battle that had never gotten dust on its knees. Angels hovered over soldiers who had all the right scars in all the right places. A fountain sang with actual water, and no one counted the drops. Light fell through stained panels like expensive opinions. The manse breathed in silence that smelled of ownership. I walked behind the porter while he moved with a calm that said doors opened because they feared to keep him waiting. The corridor lengths were measured in carpets, and the carpets were measured in generations. Statues watched with blind eyes carved by hands that wanted to be remembered for their restraint. The shrine was a chapel with gold that stayed where it was put. Candles burned without smoke, as if the air refused to be marked. A priest recited in a voice that made doctrine feel like bedtime. The family pews were spaced like planets that knew their orbits would never intersect. I held my cap in both hands and felt the fabric sweat like a minor criminal. A house serf took my name again and hung it on a peg where notices go to grow polite. They led me to a lumen array that had been sulking for weeks because no one spoke to it in a language with enough grease in the vowels. The array lived in a ceiling taller than any ambition I had considered appropriate. It had ribs of orichalcum and mirrors that winked like conspirators. I greeted the spirit with a stanza learned from men who repair things heavier than insults. The spirit shivered and then relaxed the way big cats relax when they decide not to eat. I climbed a ladder that promised discretion. From up there, the manse looked like a diagram of serenity. Velvet curtains rehearsed their ripples. Tableware sat in formation like soldiers awaiting champagne. A lady crossed the atrium below with a familiar who walked as if gravity charged rent. Her hairstyle cost more than the water ration of my block. Her perfume rose like a gentle argument against hardship. She spoke to a steward in a dialect of concern that knew a door would be blamed if anything broke. The steward bowed in a fraction that looked measured by surveyors. I tightened the lens frame and whispered compliments until the screws accepted their destiny. When the array flared to life, the light smoothed every surface into a better opinion of itself. A child clapped from the balcony, and a tutor hushed him with a glance that had passed exams. Tea arrived on a tray carried by a servitor with a porcelain mask that wore a permanent, gentle surprise. I declined because my hands were full of wire and uncertainty. They nodded as if refusal had been a lesson planned in advance. A portrait watched me from a gilt frame with eyes that seemed to know how many steps I had climbed. The plaque read, Lord Something of Something, and the dates were arranged like trophies. The painter had captured confidence with brush strokes that looked like signatures. I finished the rite of closure, and the array purred like a domesticated star. The porter returned and smiled so faintly I first mistook it for a draft. He said the house was grateful and meant the house was briefly satisfied. I replaced my cap and walked back through corridors that edited footsteps. A window gave onto a terrace where a pair of hawks perched on gilded talons and examined the world for negligence. The city below spread like a ledger written in fire and iron. For a moment I felt light enough to forgive elevations. Then I took the lift down, and the air reminded me what it costs to breathe. Days later, I rode a freighter whose corridors smelled like hot pennies and intention. We dropped into the red weather of a forge world that had married smoke and lightning. The sky there is an instruction shouted by furnaces. The ground is riveted to itself for safety. The wind carries filings that cut the cheek and then apply a balm of ash. My billet was a forge cell with walls that sweated oil honestly. The door shut with a clang that ended conversations 3 rooms away. The lumen burned steady because the adept who blessed it kept notes. Heat moved like a crowd on payday. On the shelf sat a cog-toothed icon that looked like it had bitten something unfortunate. A censer dangled from a conduit and bled incense that smelled like metal, dreaming of forests. My bunk was a slab with a blanket that had learned to be a towel in emergencies. The pillow was a coil of rags wrapped in wire to discourage theft and encourage posture. I stowed my kit, and the kit sighed like it had seen this place before. The foundry beyond the cell roared the way oceans roar in legends told by people who have never seen an ocean. Machines the size of ambition stamped plates that would become other machines. Presses descended with the certainty of falling cities. Manipulator arms danced like saints in the grip of revelation. Red robes moved in pairs, chanting the gospel of torque and tolerance. Servo skulls zipped between gantries like ideas dangerous enough to require bone. The air tasted of iron filings, scorched prayer, and the sweetness of coolant. I was assigned to Noctis Bay 12 under an overseer whose face had been simplified by years of heat into a mask that smiled only when the numbers lined up. His voice sounded like grit sliding down a steel chute. He taught me the local devotions and their penalties. We greased bearings with incense because the spirit preferred flattery with lubrication. We tapped housings 3 times with the back of a wrench because 3 is the number that convinces stubborn bolts that you know their middle name. We kept a tally of blessings and breakdowns on a slate that shed chalk like dandruff. The machine spirits in the line were temperamental but consistent. The extruder sulked if you did not compliment its symmetry. The roller sang just a little flat, unless the floor was swept in the direction of planetary rotation. The cutter refused to behave for anyone who had not bled on it politely. I bled on it politely, and the cutter accepted me into the family of minor injuries. Lunch was served in canisters that clicked when opened, as if applauding survival. We ate nutrient slabs that softened in the heat until they became confessions. Water was thick and clean in a way that felt engineered rather than merciful. Conversations were short and useful, and trained to duck under alarms. When the bell for prayer rang, we faced the altar of stripped gears and recited a litany that honored tolerances with a fervor other worlds reserve for tenderness. The adept at the altar wore mechadendrites that moved like clever snakes in a dream about algebra. He swung the censer and smoke-sketched diagrams that looked correct even when you did not understand them. Our amen was a synchronized tightening of bolts. Breaks were measured in the time it takes a bar to count to 5 and a fan to exhale twice. I learned to sleep sitting up against a warm conduit with my ear turned so the thump of coolant could remind my heart of pacing. Every so often, the foreman would test the emergency system with a grin that meant someone above him had frowned. Fans howled. Sirens phrased their concerns in 3 languages. Sprinklers coughed steam like old men telling their favorite story. We would stand in lines with our hands visible and our tools on the ground, while a drone peered into our pockets with a charity that bordered on intimacy. Then the lights would wink back into firm reality, and we would retrieve our tools with a gratitude that looked suspiciously like relief. I was given a corner shrine for personal devotions that doubled as a lockbox. Inside I kept a cog blessed by a road priest, a strip of parchment stained by solvent and hope, and a photo of a field that might have been real. At night, the foundry did not sleep so much as shift its weight onto a different hip. The tone of the roar changed key, and the sparks rose like conversational stars. The dormitory row hummed with men and women who breathed like bellows. In the common wash, a line of valves dripped in sync as if they had attended the same school. The water ran hot enough to persuade skin to forgive the day. Steam filled the room with a fog that erased faces and left silhouettes with calluses. On the bench, an old tech with a face welded to a mild smile sharpened a scraper until it reflected the lumen sharp enough to trim a thought. He told stories about a forge where the spirits were gentler and the quotas crueler, and I decided gentleness made cruelty busy. Once a week, a spire noble toured the bay with an expression that could have been interest or could have been indigestion. He wore a respirator polished to a shine that made the air look guilty. His retinue moved like a moving fence between him and the world. He asked about output in a tone that suggested numbers were a social event. We showed him charts that glowed a healthy red and lines that hugged the optimistic curve. He nodded and pronounced the word commendable with the care of a man adjusting a ring. After he left, the overseer exhaled, and the line sped up as if to undo the visit. The forge taught me the physics of patience. Metal forgives if you acknowledge its grievances in the right order. Heat listens if you give it boundaries with your hands and your attention. Noise stops being noise when you learn which thumps are speech. I found a rhythm inside the tyranny, a set of steps that let me move without argument. I learned the weight of a spanner by fingertip, the pitch of a bearing by heart, the moment a bolt would give by smell. When a line jammed the bay, inhaled its breath, and 30 minds bent toward the same knot with a kind of worship. We loosened plates and tightened expectations, and slid shims into gaps where doctrine had neglected to account for reality. When the jam broke free, the bay cheered like a living thing that had just coughed up a stubborn piece of night. I visited the spire again on a parts run, and the lift took the same patient route through incomes. The manse doors opened with a whisper that sounded like old silk remembering a dance. The same porter greeted me, and this time my name stuck to his sleeve for 3 whole steps. I delivered a crate cradled in foam thick enough to sleep on for a month. Inside the crate lay a regulator valve etched with sigils that told safer stories when they were polished. The steward signed for it with a pen that weighed as much as responsibility. He asked if the forge was loud, and I said it was honest. He considered that phrase like a coin with unfamiliar metal. I was allowed to pass through the kitchen, where heat behaved like a trained animal and knives sang careful songs. A cook sprinkled salt from a height that made gravity feel appreciated. He winked at me and slipped a crust into my palm that tasted like 3 countries and 1 pact. I swallowed it quietly and let generosity argue with the memory in my chest. A balcony opened onto air that had opinions about laundry but none about quotas. The city again spread below like a schematic for ambition. I imagined the line of the tram tracking back to the manufactorum, and then to the foundry, and then to the shipyard, and then to the void, and I felt like a small, necessary punctuation mark in a sentence too long to read aloud. Back at the forge, the overseer laughed when I described the fountain that wasted water with grace. He said waste is a technology that requires wealth and practice. He said the spire ran on the gravity generated by our work. He said the manse and the forge were married by laws that do not ask for consent. I believed him and kept tightening bolts. The workers in the cell beside mine played cards with rules that changed whenever the fan changed speed. The stakes were nails and stories, and the occasional extra slice of nutrient slab negotiated out of a vendor with compliments. I lost a nail and won a story about a machine that fell in love with a song. I hummed the song later to a gearbox that would not seat, and it seated with a finality that looked a lot like agreement. On the 7th night of the rotation, the adept led a procession through the bays to bless the master forge. Drums tapped a heartbeat, and vox hymns braided with the hiss of steam. We carried spanners like candles and candles like spanners. The floor shook in a way that made teeth feel like memories. Sparks rose in sheets, and for a heartbeat it looked like all the stars had come home. And then the sparks faded into the dark above the cranes where birds never perch. A new worker arrived from the lower hive with hands that measured poverty. We taught him which prayers soothed which bearings. We taught him the sign for stop, and the sign for here, and the sign for good enough today. We taught him where to hang his jacket so the heat would not burn his name out of it. He taught us a joke about a saint who demanded better tools, and we laughed almost loud enough to be fined. When I finally lay down on the slab, my back hummed with the same note as the wall. Sleep came like a mechanic with the right wrench. I dreamed of the manse halls and the forge bays, swapping lights and music for one night, without telling anyone above them. In the dream, the fountain ran with coolant that reflected constellations built from indicator lamps. In the dream, the forge fans blew perfume scented like rain on rust. In the dream, both places admitted they were rooms in the same house. I woke before the bell with the taste of iron and citrus, and I decided both could be true if you worked long enough. I washed my face in water that never apologized. I tied my boots while the dormitory learned its chorus. I touched the cog-toothed icon and the ragged parchment and the Maybefield photo. I stepped into a corridor that roared me gently toward another day that expected precision to pass for love. I carried the spire's silence in one pocket and the forge's song in the other. I promised both I would make the next bolt seat without complaint. I promised the next door I opened I would speak to kindly, even if it had forgotten my name. On a void ship home is a coffin rack with a curtain and a nameplate. You etch yourself. The rack is stacked 6 high in a compartment that remembers storms. I took the 3rd tier because it is far enough from the deck to pretend you have risen and far enough from the overhead to pretend you have room. The mattress is a pad that learned endurance from armor plates. The curtain is a scrap of sailcloth retired from a launch that once misjudged a landing. I stitched an aquila on the hem with cable thread that will outlive me. On the bulkhead, I painted a saint in soot and oil with eyes that look left for danger and right for luck. My locker is a steel mouth that chews through padlocks and spits out humility. Inside it, I keep a mug with a cracked lip that fits my own, a bent spoon that remembers soup as a rumor, a folded pict of a horizon with no walls, and a charm made from a macro cannon primer cap drilled safe. The deck under my boots hums in 2 notes that argue like old lovers. One note is the plasma heart telling us it is awake. The other is the void complaining that we are here. I sleep with a hand on the webbing strap because sometimes the grav plates remember they are lies. When they forget, I do not want to meet the overhead like an apology. The air tastes of tin, incense, and the sweat of people who do not get to choose their company. We call it ship breath, and we inhale it like wages. The lumen over the hatch flickers only when the Geller charm nailed to the frame wants attention. I tap the charm with my knuckle, and it answers by not answering. Silence from the right talisman is the best sound a spacer hears. Down the passage, the pipes rattle in a pattern that says the recyclers are singing through grit. Our deck gang praises the grit because it proves the filters are catching something. The mess is a long room that smells like warm metal and arguments settled by cards. Benches are bolted to the deck because fights are quicker when furniture cannot help. The cook ladles protein stew from a vat that traveled farther than most of us. The stew tastes of mushrooms that never saw a sun and meat that used to be a concept. I drop a chit on the counter, and the cook drops a ladle in my bowl with the mercy of routine. We eat elbow to elbow with men and women whose names are boats we do not board. Names matter when the klaxons speak and matter less when the cards fall. I sip recaf that could strip paint, and I call it flavor. A voidsman tells a joke about a navigator's third eye, and we laugh carefully so the ship will not notice. We do not say navigator too loudly because some words ripple. We say the witch in the spire, and everyone nods as if the shape of the sentence keeps us safe. The chapel sits in a bend where the bulkhead curves like a rib. Inside the icon is brass and soot and a relic that looks like a tooth or a gear or a promise. The priest wears void leather patched with prayers and keeps a shotgun under the lectern that does not believe in metaphor. He blesses the void with a voice that knows it cannot be persuaded but refuses to be quiet. He blesses our boots because boots go where faith cannot. He blesses the macro cannon crews because gun decks are cathedrals that eat men. Our watches are measured in bells that argue with sleep. Midwatch is when the hull groans like an old saint stretching on a rack. Forenoon is when the machine spirits purr as if remembering kindness. Dogwatch is when the mess fills with laughter that clings to ribs like grease. I stand duty at section valve 12 with a spanner and a litany. The litany is for the valve, and the spanner is for everything else. My palms learn the temperature of truth by touch. When the valve sings sharp, I loosen its pride and tighten its future. When it sings flat, I check the gauge and blame the last man and forgive him. The Auspex repeater over the bulkhead shows our course as a line crawling across a darkness that pretends to be empty. The line kinks when the helm fights currents no one on deck will ever see. The helm does not explain, and we do not ask because explanations kneel for no one during translation. Translation drills come without warning because real translations come with worse. The klaxon stutters the three-note prayer that makes your stomach walk toward your throat. We clip harnesses to guide rails that feel like real friends. We check the Geller chimes hung above each hatch, and we listen for the wrong music. The priest walks the passage, muttering the old names and the new numbers. The lights dull to a bruise, and then brighten to a dare, and then dull again until the whole ship seems to be listening to itself. The Vox crackles with the navigator's monotone reciting mathematics that should not fit inside a human mouth. The bridge answers with coordinates and confidence, and a silence shaped like a blade. I hold my Saint Charm in one hand and the rail with the other, and I keep both hands honest. The air goes thin at the edges as if the world is a photograph curling in heat. My teeth taste copper and old prayers, and the Geller charms tick like insects counting. Something large passes through the idea of our hull, and the deck shivers as if refusing an invitation. A scream echoes down the passage that might be steam or might be a hymn sung incorrectly by a machine. The lumen flickers and stays, and I love that stubborn light like a brother. The translation ends with a thud, like a giant closing a door gently on purpose. We breathe at the same time, and the mess ladles a thicker stew because everyone did the hard part together. On patrol days, the ship stretches its limbs and pretends to be a hunting cat. Macro cannon drills rattle plates and polish soles. We run lines of powder monkeys whose arms are all rope and speed. We seat shells the size of confessionals into breaches that smell like storms. The chief of ordnance paces with a stick that strikes sparks from discipline. He calls the guns by saints' names, and the saints answer with thunder. The lance crews in their hooded alcoves whisper to capacitors that could erase a town and ask them to be patient. Void shields murmur on the status board in bars of green that look fragile and are not. When pirates appear, they look like punctuation against the infinite. They grow teeth when the Auspex officer says, "Contact," and the Vox hands out coordinates that become work. We lift covers and bolt dreams to rails, and wait for the bridge to speak in the voice of numbers turned into law. If the order is fire, the deck becomes a theology of recoil. The hull jumps and the lights nod and the guns cough bright anger. I feel the wave in my knees and thank the plates for remembering gravity. Sometimes the order is repel borders and the theology becomes personal. Hatches slam like gavel blows. Bulkhead seals bite down. Shotguns come out of lockers that would rather hold blankets. We fit on our void cowls and smear unguents across seals that try to be honest. I carry a pry bar because doors have opinions. The boarders come loud or quiet depending on their confidence and chemical habits. We meet them with the measured hospitality of a house that does not want guests. Afterward, the decks smell of promethium, blood, and the awkward relief of survival. We scrub until steel shows a face we can live with. We stack the fallen in shrouds that know the stars better than we do. Burial detail stands to attention at an open lock where the void presses its face to the glass. The priest speaks, and the master at arms speaks, and the ship speaks by staying. The bodies slide into the dark like commas in a sentence that does not end. We salute, and we return to valves and charts and cards because work keeps ghosts polite. Not all dangers come with teeth you can see. Sometimes the grav plates hiccup, and your stomach considers mutiny. Sometimes a micrometeor makes a new pinhole in an old story. Sometimes the recycler coughs up a smell that says a filter has decided to retire early. Sometimes the astropath choir screams when no one is touching them. When the choir screams, we put our hands on the nearest metal and tell it we will not leave. When the choir is quiet, we walk softer because quiet can be brittle. The astropath cloister is down now, and left, then right, and then through a door that remembers promises. You can feel the air shiver near it, as if the ship has nerves. No one goes in without a blessing and a reason and a stomach that forgives. We leave offerings outside of tallow and tin saints and sweets from rations we cannot spare. On lucky days, a parchment appears on the hatch with a drawing of a star with a smile. We laugh and we tape it to the mess wall because kindness is ballast. The flight deck is a cave where the ship keeps its vast ideas. Arvus lighters sit like patient beetles with bellies meant for crates and prayers. Shuttle crews wear harnesses of straps and superstition. Deckhands guide with wands that glow like discipline and dance like necessity. Engines cough, shriek, purr, and settle in the prearranged order that keeps people whole. When a bird comes in hot, the deck becomes a single muscle. Foam floods a line like a miracle that knows plumbing. Men run in and drag someone out by the straps while telling jokes about shore leave to keep him from dying from the wrong cause. I service the fuel lines and I leave a ribbon on the tap because the spirit likes company. The Medici bay sits 2 decks below my rack and 1 deck above courage. Its doors open for everyone and close for no one. Inside, the air smells like antiseptic, burned hair, and promises you will be okay, said with professional skill. A chirurgeon with chrome fingers sews men back into shapes the ship can use. He hums a lullaby he learned from a servo that never clicks off beat. The beds are too few, and the words are enough because they must be. The master of Vox runs a room where lightning is taught manners. Cables lie coiled like tame snakes. Dials wink like conspirators who go home early. He tunes channels with thumb and prayer and hears merchants begging, navies ordering, and things that do not use voices at all. We listen on headsets that smell like generations and salt water that never knew an ocean. Sometimes we pick up a hymn from nowhere and we sing along until it fades, and then we do not discuss it. In the lower bays, the ratings carve scrimshaw on old bone and newer plastic. Saints grow from knife tips brighter than their material. We trade the pieces for favors and for luck and for a moment of being seen. A boy from Deck 20 gave me a scrimshaw of a Vox angel with a broken wing, and I hung it in my rack where the curtain can see it. He said it would fix the sound of my sleep, and I believed him. We ink our skins with stations and sins because memory needs maps. A line of dots marks my watches across the year like a constellation that changes only when you beg it to. A small ship curls behind my ear where only friends will notice. The bosun runs drill with a cane that knows every shin by name. He teaches knots that can hold a secret, and knots that can hold a man, and knots that can hold a soul together long enough to cross a bad patch. He makes us coil lines so neatly the emperor could play them like instruments. We swear under our breath and obey out loud because both habits keep you alive. The purge system tests come when we wish they would not. Valves stutter and bulkheads cough, and the ducts roar like a beast who has remembered the original forest. We seal hatches, swap masks, and count breaths with the calm of gamblers. Afterward, the air tastes sharper, and the ship seems pleased. Cargo holds are cities that move. Crates rise and float and settle in nets that trust math. Pallet servitors waddle on piston legs and apologize to your ankles by never quite hitting them. We mark manifests with grease and chalk, and a pencil stub borrowed from a purser who counts with mercy. On inspection days, a junior officer brings a checklist and a nervous smile. We show him clean corners and honest dust, and he shows us a signature that will keep a warden off our backs. The captain is a story we salute. I have seen him twice at distance and once in a reflection. He wears a coat heavy with weather we have not sailed. His eye has a lens that clicks when it judges. He speaks with the tone of a man who knows which lives are spent like coin and which are banked for winter. We trust him because he has brought us back more times than the tally says he could. When he walks the deck, the ship squares its shoulders. The navigator lives in a tower that grows from the spine like an idea you should not touch. We do not go there because we like our minds the way they are. Sometimes a smell slips down the stair like ozone and old books, and we know a course has been folded into a new shape. Sometimes a shadow crawls across the bulkhead like ink in water, and we look at our boots until it passes through to a place that understands it. The quartermaster runs stores with the intelligence of famine. He can stretch a bolt into 2 bolts by will and complaint. He weighs favors by the gram and mercy by the kilo, but forgets debts if you help him fix the tally slate. He slipped me a new filter when mine began to wheeze, and I slipped him a charm that had kept a valve honest for years, and we said nothing about either. Shore leave is a myth that visits in pamphlets. The pamphlets show beaches and beverages, and people who laugh like they have not memorized a damage control chart. We pin the pamphlets above our racks and let the moisture curl them into new continents. When we do drop to a port, it is usually for hours and never for enough. The docks smell like money trying to disguise itself as salt. Vendors sell saints and sins from the same blanket. I buy a spool of thread and a packet of spice and a story about a woman who owns a window. I come back aboard early and stand on the ramp looking at the ship. And I feel the feeling you feel when you look at a house that has learned your steps. Our superstitions are tools that never dull. We do not whistle in passage because calling wind at sea brings storms and calling wind in space brings auditors. We do not speak the number between 7 and 9 when counting lifeboats because one of them is shy. We touch the same rivet before sleep because the rivet is stubborn and we want its company. We never thank the void for a smooth run because the void is vain. We thank the plates and the pipes and the gauges because they are jealous in the right way. In the small hours I walk the catwalk above the engine spaces where heat climbs like ladders. The plasma coils glow the color of decisions. The engineerium chants in rounds that never quite resolve. I lay a coin on the rail for the spirit, and the spirit leaves it there because it has no pockets. On convoy duty, we drift among ships that look like cousins and strangers. Tugs nudge bulkers like nurses moving giants. An escort frigate cuts the dark with a poise that borders on rude. We signal with lamps and codes and grudges. I watch a pilgrim ship pass with windows full of faces that have not yet learned to be disappointed by stars. I salute them because belief is a propulsion system. Sometimes the console lights blink a pattern that means an auger has noticed interest. We go to stations with the precision of habit taught by fear. The gun decks sweat and the bridge breathes and the vox speaks in clipped sentences that sound like a heartbeat. If trouble decides to be serious, the shields load with a sound like rain that has been taught math. We feel the hits as a change in grammar. We return punctuation in kind. After the noise stops, we count and we write, and we clean and we eat, and we say nothing useful to anyone who was not there. The ship's library is a locker with a lock that dreams of philosophy. Inside are manuals that tell the truth and chapbooks that try. There is a primer with the corners thumbed to fur and a deck-worn copy of a navigator's romance that lies about kindness. I read 3 pages at a time between alarms and sleep, and I never lose my place because the ship keeps it for me. A rat lives somewhere in our compartment, and we let it because it eats things that would rather eat us slowly. We call it Admiral and salute it when it runs the beam. On Emperor's Day, we hang lamps from the rail and drink from a barrel that arrived with stamps and left with stories. The priest blesses the barrel, and the barrel blesses us back. We sing until the Auspex officer knocks on the overhead with a wrench in the rhythm that means tone it down, but not all the way. The bosun tells the tale of a ship that sailed into its own wake and came out older and kinder. We pretend to believe every word because pretending together is the closest thing to shore we will see for a while. In my rack, I pin the curtains shut with a chipped clip and lay my head where the deck can speak up through the pad. I count the beats until the plasma note lines up with the coolant note, and the whole ship seems to breathe from the same chest. I tell the saint in soot to keep watch while I borrow rest. I place the macro cannon cap charm on my tongue to remember thunder without fear. I let the Geller charms tick walk me down a stair made of seconds. I close my eyes, and the hull creaks like a door someone is holding closed, and I breathe with it because that is what people do when a house is not entirely sure the night will mind its manners.